Hello everybody. Oh sorry, my voice got a bit after today on the freshest fair. Welcome to the first meeting of Warwick Marxist Society 2017-18. And we'll be today discussing why do we need Marx today. Just give like a show of hands who's been to any Marxist Society meetings before or anything like that. Okay, so you got like a few people, but okay, mostly not everyone. So just give a bit of context what the Marxist Society is. We're here to discuss the ideas of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels and many others on what they meant in socialism, capitalism and all of that. But as well, the point isn't just to interpret the world, the point is to change it. And we're also part of other organisations, the Marxist Student Federation, International Marxist Centre and many others actually seeking to change capitalism. Now you want to create a really friendly, nice debate, so you don't have to agree with Marxism, you can just be curious. You could actively come and oppose us, but we ask for that not, please. But if anyone really feels a need to go and shout at some Tory propaganda, feel free. And I'll accept it for like 3 lines. So basically try and keep it an open debate. What's going on, and why about the ideas socialism, radical politics today. So to do this, we will have a series of discussions. Has anyone not seen the term cards so far? Okay, everyone's seen the term cards, I'll assume. So you know, but we have a series of discussions on loads of different topics, from everything from where is Britain going, what is Marxism, that we're having today, Marxism and automation, feminism, black struggle, and all those things. Also culminating, in week 3 culminating, in our October Revolution event, a whole week's worth of events from Monday to Sunday on the October Revolution, looking at the events of 1917, 100 years on, in which we're planning to do loads both in Warwick and outside, including a discussion, a debate, a film showing, a social, and also, and I do want to raise this, coming to the October Revolution Festival. There's even more people. But anyway, so just to fill you in, with the Marxist Society, we talk about Karl Marx. That's kind of the short version of it. And like people who like Karl Marx. Sometimes that's good, don't like it. So yeah, we're going to, on the 20th to the 22nd of October, end of week 3, for anyone who's given up on the normal calendar and now just uses the work one. We're going to the London Revolution event. There's going to be a fantastic number of speakers. Giving similar talks to how we're doing here. Everyone from Trotsky's grandson, Esteban Volkov, appearing over Skype, to Matt Rack of the Fire Brigade Union, and hundreds of other talks, many other talks, looking at the ideas of Marxism, Marxist philosophy, the Russian Revolution, fascism, all of these things. It's really good value. It's £10 for students, £20 for people who are waged, to go to London. We'll all be heading down as a society, and that also includes the ticket cost and accommodation. But by having such a great deal, and also being a national event, we do kind of need confirmation by tomorrow, and ideally tonight, if you do want to come to this festival, so do let us know. So that's a bit of admin stuff out of the way. So yeah, how this event works, we're going to have Adam, he's going to speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, on the question of why do we need Marx today, giving an overview of Marxism, all things like that. We're going to go to an open discussion. Anyone can raise any points, questions, contributions, and keep a lively discussion. We'll then either come back to Adam over a few questions if it feels necessary, or at the end. This should take us up to approximately 7:30, if I can read the clock correctly, and we'll then hoping to go to Terrace Bar, where the Labour Party are having a social, and also to discuss there, and have a good discussion, stuff like that. So do highly recommend. Please keep coming to our events there in this room every day, Thursday, 6 p.m. So without more nattering on, thank you very much, and Adam, start.
Okay. Hi, so my name's Adam. I am an activist with the International Marxist Tendency, who in Britain produced the paper Socialist Appeal. Some of you have got it already, I see. And I'm the editor of Socialist Appeal's website, socialist.net. Apologies for my very hoarse throat. I've just come from our Oxford Marxist Society, where we signed up 400 people over the last 2 days to the Oxford Marxist Society, and that's obviously one of the more elitist, we should say, institutions in the country. But yet, the fact that we signed up 400 people, then I'm sure many similar numbers kind of around the country, and here in Warwick, the massive turnout we've got tonight. All of this is obviously a vindication, if you like, that there's an enormous radicalisation, I would say, in society, and particularly amongst the youth. And I think that in turn reflects the fact that we're living through, I would say, the most turbulent period in history. Turbulence and kind of uncertainty, this volatility really at every level. Economically now, we're in the 10th year of a financial crisis, of an economic crisis, a world crisis of capitalism at root, we would say. That's now reflected also in terms of a social crisis, people questioning all the old certainties that used to exist. It's represented also as an ecological crisis, an environmental crisis, which has been going on for many decades before. And then obviously also now what we're seeing as well is a political crisis. The fact that everywhere you look, in country after country, the status quo has failed, the old centre ground, the liberal kind of world order, if you like, has fallen apart. And you're seeing these swings to the right, obviously, with people like Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage and Jacob Rees-Mogg and all these other unholy names that I should say no more of. But you're also seeing the swings to the left, and that's what we shouldn't forget as well. It's a polarisation, a fragmentation of the old political order. And the swings to the left, obviously, we see, again, in country after country. Alongside Trump, you see Sanders. Alongside Le Pen, you see Mélenchon. And obviously in Britain, alongside the figures like Jacob Rees-Mogg, you do see, obviously, Jeremy Corbyn and the massive movement behind him. And I think we need to understand what's causing these kind of processes to unfold, this kind of chaotic, uncertain process. And what's incredible, really, is that you look around at the so-called experts, the kind of traditional political commentators, the economists, I'm sure many of the very fine academics in your institution here, and all of them will really, unfortunately, have no answers to the kind of questions that people are asking today. You know, as I say, it's 10 years into this crisis, and there's not a single economist anywhere who's got a solution to how to get out of the crisis. There's no real recovery to it, as truth be told. And in fact, you even had Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman saying that at the time of the crisis in 2008, which, you know, is a decade ago, as I said, you know, the whole of our political lives, the whole of our conscious political lives, all of us here, all we can remember is this crisis, this austerity, this volatility and uncertainty. But Paul Krugman said, at best, everything we've taught for the last 30 years was wrong, and at worst, it was harmful. And therefore, it's no surprise that you find, in the absence of any explanation from these so-called experts, you find people turning to the ideas of a man who died over 130 years ago and saying Marx was right. You've had lots of mainstream kind of journals and so forth putting forward this title, Marx was right, saying, I think it was in Time magazine and many others, they've had this title looking at the question of what is it that Marx actually said, can we learn anything from him? Obviously all of these kind of mainstream publications, they all ascribe to, if you like, within a certain narrow spectrum of debate, and therefore they'll say, you know, Marx was right on this and that, but ultimately, you know, he was wrong on this, and we shouldn't really try and overthrow the system, but just try and tinker around the edges. So I think it's up to us to actually go back and look exactly at what Marx said over 130 years ago, what he wrote in his writing, and see what's Marxism really about, and can it actually shed light on the problems we face today. I think if you want to make a start on this, I think the best thing to pick up is a pamphlet written almost 170 years ago in 1848, which is the Manifesto of the Communist Party, otherwise known as the Communist Manifesto. This is my slightly old, tatty copy that's obviously seen better days, but that's because I read it every year. And I'll tell you what, I read it every year, not just to prepare for talks like this, but because also you find constantly stuff in here that's incredibly modern. Every time you read it, something new comes out. You know, it's incredibly prophetic, actually, when you read the Communist Manifesto and you see the world that Marx was describing then. It's actually more like the world we see now than the world he actually lived through at the time. The predictions he makes are based on an understanding of how capitalism works, of how society operates. He was able to predict things like globalization long before it became a word. The expansion of the world market, he said, the search of the capitalists for ever greater profits, chasing them across the globe, and he said, breaking down the Chinese walls and establishing a common market everywhere, a common culture everywhere in the image of capitalism back home. And this was at a time when really the only capitalist economies that existed were Britain, France, maybe Germany and America, and yet he predicted this this process. Monopolization, another thing he talks about in the Communist Manifesto, the idea that the world economy would come to be dominated by a handful of companies in every industry, and on a multinational companies at that. And again, it's at a time when really he's mainly looking at the perspective of what was going on in Britain. But today it's very true, you know. Look at the stark inequality that we see around us. Oxfam every year releasing these figures about the number of billionaires who own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world's population. I think the figure now is down to something eye-watering, like just 8 billionaires, I think it is, now own as much as the bottom 50% of the world's population. A startling statistic and a real damning indictment of modern-day capitalism, and capitalism in general, I would say. But before we, you know, instead of trying to make it sound like Marx was some sort of prophet, some sort of messianic figure who just, you know, this omniscient entity who kind of came down and foresaw all of this, I think it's worth understanding what Marx's method was that allowed him to actually make such predictions. He wasn't some sort of deity, and he's not. And Marxism is not some sort of dogma that we should just recite back. It's a method fundamentally. It's a philosophy for understanding the world around us, for understanding how society, how nature, how the economy, how people, how consciousness, how all of these things change. And that's the key thing behind Marxism as a philosophy. The understanding that at root, everything changes. There's nothing static in this world. There's no eternal truths, if you like. You know, no matter what capitalism says. Capitalism actually bases itself as an ideology on formalism, on kind of religious ideology and idealism. These kind of ideas that say to us that the way we live today is the only way you can live. That it's the only way we've ever lived, and it's the only way we shall ever live. In other words, you know, there's no point in trying to change this world. Seek, you know, solace in the afterlife, if you like. That's the origins of religion, Marx said. It's the opiate of the masses, the heart of a heartless world. In other words, a way for people to find some sort of solace in the future because they couldn't get any real living, you know, they didn't have a real life to enjoy on this planet. But we as Marxists want to change the world that's around us here. We're materialists, in other words. We try and find an explanation for what's going on in the world, not by recourse to gods and spirits and, you know, eternal truths and things like that, but rather try and understand the actual processes at play at all levels and find explanations in you know, scientifically, if you like. Marx called himself a scientific socialist. He didn't coin the term Marxism. Him and Engels used the term scientific socialism. In other words, what they wanted to explain was how the world operated in not just at a natural level, like natural sciences explain to us, like physics and chemistry, you know, where obviously we try and look at, as I say, explain the world through laws, through understanding processes and so forth, understanding interactions. Marx said the same thing could apply at society, at a societal level, at an economic level, that we should aim to understand the world around us as a scientist would nature. And in that sense, as I say, we are materialists. And at the root of Marx's explanation about society and how that changes, he said, you know, the real key to understanding society is that history is not made by great men and women with great ideas. You know, that's the way that the history textbooks you read today would have us believe, that history is just kind of a process, almost of random events that whereby, you know, certain great individuals assert their ideology upon society. Marx said, flipped it on its head and said it's the other way around. It's not great men and women who make history, but the history that produces great men and women, if you like. It's that certain historical epochs call forth certain types of individuals to carry out the demands that history, that ordinary people require of them. In other words, Marx said there is no such thing as history in the abstract. There's ordinary men and women going about their lives, trying to you know, make a living in this world. But in doing so, they come into conflict with one another. Why? Because at root, society is not just a load of individuals, as Margaret Thatcher said once. You know, she said there is no such thing as society. Well, we say it's the other way around. There's no such thing as the individual. The point is that, as Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, opening paragraph, all of history is the history of class struggle between the oppressors and the oppressed, the exploiters and the exploited. In the slavery times, it was the slave and the slave master. In feudal times, it was the peasant and the landlord. Today, under capitalism, it's the worker and the capitalist. In other words, the 99%, the vast majority of us who own nothing but our ability to work, and the capitalist, the tiny rich minority elite that has the means of production, that has the wealth and technology in society, and that buys up our labour power, that puts workers to work in order to make a profit. And that really is the key behind capitalism. It's a profit-making system. It's a system where production is for profit, where you have the capitalist with the capital, this wealth that is seeking to make more wealth. That's what Marx meant by capital. The idea that there was money that seeks just to make more money. That's the purpose of the capitalist. He said the capitalist is capital personified. They seek to make money out of money. And in doing so, the way they do this, Marx said, is that they buy up the labour power of the worker. The worker comes to the capitalist looking for work and looking for a wage in return, and they sell themselves to the capitalist. They sell their ability to work to the capitalist. The capitalist buys up a day or a week or a year of the worker's labour power, and it's up to the capitalist then to squeeze as much value as they can, squeeze as much wealth as they can out of the worker within that time period. And in return, the worker receives just a fraction of the value that they produce back in the form of wages. And the excess, that unpaid labour of the working class, that is the source of the capitalist profits, the surplus value, Marx called it. Because ultimately it's the working class that creates all value in society, Marx pointed out. There's nothing exists that has any value that doesn't have labour applied to it. And it's the unpaid labour of the working class that causes, that results in the capitalist profits. But at the end of the day, the capitalism, Marx pointed out, is this profit, this drive to make profits that Marx actually said makes capitalism in its heyday quite a progressive system, a very progressive system, a revolutionary system, actually, he says, in its heyday. And you read in the Communist Manifesto, the first few pages, Marx is brimming with reverence towards the capitalist system. Says it's a progressive system that sweeps away all the old barriers of feudalism. It accumulates all the scattered production of the peasants, throws them into the cities, creates massive industries. He says it accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids and Roman aqueducts, put all former exoduses to shame. In other words, he said it was this drive for profits that precisely created, as I say, the world market, created these giant monopolies and multinationals, and created this ability to produce enormous amounts of wealth, to raise living standards to unprecedented levels. You just look at the figures for GDP, they're stagnant for millennia until capitalism comes along, and then suddenly GDP on a world scale shoots up because of this drive for profits, this competition that forces the capitalists to reinvest their profits constantly into new technologies, into new science, into new industry, into new means of production, as Marx called it. And in this sense, created this these monopolies, created this concentration of population in the cities, created this technology that we see around us today. But, and there's a big but here, there's a big massive but, and it's that everything changes, as I say. Everything eventually turns into its opposite. And all these things that made capitalism progressive, this motor force behind capitalism that drove society forwards and developed all these wonders that Marx talked about, all of that at a certain point turn into their opposite and become a barrier actually to the development of society. We see that very much today, that the fact that competition and profit now have become a barrier to scientific progress, because it's the competition, the drive for profit that lead to the austerity we see, that's cutting away at scientific budgets, that's cutting away at research and development, that's forcing different teams of scientists to compete against each other instead of working together to produce better things that society needs. It's the profit motive that stands in the way of us investing in decent jobs, in green energy, in housing and so forth. At the end of the day, the capitalists only invest in these things if they can make a profit. If they can't, then capital lies idle and people lie idle. What an enormous waste, actually, capitalism is today, where you've got millions of people unemployed, forced idleness. It's not voluntary leisure, it's forced idleness. People, on the one hand, mass unemployment. On the other hand, people having to work 2 or 3 jobs just to get by. What an absurd contradiction there is. The fact that we have new technologies, automation, but we talk about it as though it's some sort of threat. They talk about technological unemployment. Why should there be any unemployment at all? Why don't we reduce the hours of the working week, share the wealth that's there, share the jobs that are there, and give everyone the time to participate in the running of society, give everyone time to get involved in developing themselves in terms of education, art and culture. This is what we should be able to do under capitalism, you know. Again, what an absurd contradiction. You have construction workers unemployed, bricks and mortar and just sitting there kind of waiting to be used, and a housing crisis where 5 million people are on the waiting list for a council house in Britain. Why aren't we putting the bricks and the mortar with the unemployed construction workers and building the houses? The land is there. It's, again, that's sitting idle. The money's there in the bank accounts of big business. In Britain alone, £750 billion sits idly, not being used. All of this is a damning indictment, as I say, on capitalism. And the same statistics, the same process you can see in country after country. It shows what an enormous barrier capitalism has become. And it all comes down to, Marx said, the fact that capitalism contains within it a massive contradiction, an inherent contradiction. What he called a crisis, the contradiction of overproduction. The fact that you get, he says in the Communist Manifesto, I don't know if I can find the passage straight away, I might have to try and remember it. Oh no, I found it straight. Okay. He says, in these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. In other words, we find an absurdity that, as he says, it just seems ridiculous, where we've got famine not because there's not enough, which is the case in previous epochs, in feudal times or slavery. When you had a famine, it was generally because there wasn't enough to go around. But now we have famine not because there's not enough, but because there's too much. In other words, the productive forces outstrip the market. The ability to buy, the money in people's pockets isn't enough to match the price that the capitalists require in order to make their profits. And so you have food going, wasted. There's literally food dumped in the seas. There's stockpiles of grain. We produce enough calories on a world scale to feed the population actually many times over. There's not too many people on the planet. The problem is there's too many capitalists with too much wealth sitting in their bank accounts not being used. That's the reality. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It's not us who are to blame for the ecological destruction. It's the unplanned, anarchic nature of capitalism and the profit motive. That's what's causing the ecological crises we see around us today. And this is the cause behind all crises, fundamentally, of capitalism. It's the cause behind the Great Depression in the 1930s, the crisis in the 70s that brought down the kind of Keynesian consensus that was established at the time, things like Bretton Woods and so forth, and ushered in the kind of neoliberal era, as it's called, of Thatcher and Reagan and the attacks on the working class. But it's also the same cause of the crisis we see around us today. I mean, when you guys, presumably most of you, 18, 19 years old, presumably about 8 years old, when George Bush came on TV and said, capitalism has failed. I won't try and do the accent. But a startling admission from one of the key representatives of capitalism himself. And also, I do find, just on a side note, when people, get very worried about Donald Trump, they seem to have forgotten just how bad George Bush and many other former presidents of the United States, and in fact representatives of capitalism worldwide, have always been. These people really represent, if you like, how degraded capitalism has become. We often say the ruling class gets the leaders it deserves. And that's why you see figures like Trump. It's why you see, quite frankly, terrible speeches by people like Theresa May yesterday. The fact that the scenery was collapsing around her, I think, was a very good metaphor for the state of British and world capitalism, which is falling apart around her. And she, as a representative of capitalism, is obviously falling apart at the seams as well, quite literally in the case of her throat. But I shouldn't speak too soon there either myself. Anyway, what we see is, as I say, poverty amidst plenty. The idea that people are going starving at a time when there's more than enough to go around. What you had over the last few decades was a process whereby in order to keep the economy going, in order to keep the market expanding and production expanding and keep the capitalists making profits, they were driving down wages, they were attacking the trade unions, they were outsourcing to China, exploiting the cheap labour that was present on the other side of the world, while simultaneously destroying industry, so-called creative destruction, as they like to call it, if anyone's an economist here and is a fan of Schumpeter, that's his word for it. His phrase for it. Well, that's what they were doing in Britain and America, what they were doing worldwide, an attack on the working class everywhere, bringing in machines to replace jobs, but yet somehow they had to maintain the demand, maintain the ability for people to buy, and therefore they expanded the credit, this big bang they called it in Britain, expanding the credit with mortgages, with credit cards, with student loans, all of these things used to put money in people's pockets that they didn't actually have in reality. And obviously, very conveniently, they have to pay that back with interest, and the banks make a bit of money in the process. And that all came collapsing down in 2008. That was the house of cards that collapsed there, the house of credit cards, we should really say. And in the words of Noam Chomsky, what they did was nationalize the debts and privatize the profits. And what we've seen ever since, really, is an attempt to basically make the working class, make the 99% pay for this crisis. That's what it comes down to. But I should emphasize at this point that we as Marxists are not interested in the economy in some sort of abstract way. We don't just want to sit around with our crystal ball predicting the crisis and saying, oh, that's when the crisis gets so bad that suddenly capitalism implodes. There's no such thing as a final crisis of capitalism. That's a nonsense. The point is that capitalism as a system is not something, again, that exists in the abstract. It's a force that seems to exist and exert some sort of control over us. But the only reason it carries on existing is because we are not conscious and organized enough to overthrow it. And what we're interested in as Marxists, therefore, is the question of consciousness, the question of political consciousness, the question of how these crises radicalize people, how consciousness changes, and how people are waking up to these injustices and are starting to demand some sort of alternative. And that's really what it comes down to today. That's what these political crises, as I say, represent at root. People are asking, how do we get out of this crisis? And the problem is, we would say, as Marxists, we would say from analysing the system around us, analysing society, we would say that the problem is not an ideological one, in the sense of, you often hear on the left today this idea that, the cuts are ideological. The cuts are ideological, It's the nasty Tories, it's nasty George Osborne, nasty Philip Hammond. Get rid of them, get in nice John McDonnell, and everything suddenly will be okay. Now, don't get me wrong, the Tories are nasty. I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is that it's not enough to replace the faces at the top in order to change this problem that mankind faces. The problem is a systematic one. The problem is capitalism itself. And as long as you have capitalism, as long as you follow the logic of capitalism, you have to carry out the cuts that capitalism demands. This is what we saw in Greece only a few years ago. A couple of years ago, just before Jeremy Corbyn got elected in Britain, you had, as Labour leader, you had Tsipras and the Syriza government in Greece being elected, and actually, despite having a radical left programme very similar to Corbyn's, they ended up under the duress of the Troika, the IMF, the bankers, the financial markets and so forth, the dictatorship of bankers. That's really what dominates under capitalism. It's not a democracy, it's a dictatorship of the bankers. And what you saw there was that Greek government, that far left government, betraying its supporters, betraying its voters, and carrying out worse cuts than what had been carried out previously by the Greek Tories. We have to look at that, analyse those lessons, and say, yes, that's the future that faces us here in Britain, not only in terms of the crisis that the Greek people have faced, in terms of a massive decline in living standards, and on a side note, the only country that matches the decline in real wages compared to Greece is Britain. The only other country in Europe that has a similar fall in real wages over the last decade to Greece is Britain. So it shows we're not that far behind. And the point is that Corbyn now looks set to become into power as well. The Economist only last week had a front cover saying the likely lad, with a picture of Corbyn carrying his Morning Star, should have been a copy of Socialist Appeal, outside of 10 Downing Street with his little cat, El Gato. That's the perspective we can see, a Labour government coming to power. But we've got to have a warning to that government. We've got to say to Corbyn, we support you, we support kicking out the Tories. We support Labour coming to power. But if you don't carry out a socialist programme, you will go the way of Cyprus. And you can only have to look at what's happened to Syriza. They've been shattered in the polls. We have to build a bottom-up movement that has at its root a Marxist programme, a revolutionary programme, a socialist programme that can say we have to get rid of capitalism. That's the problem here. We need to take over the banks, the major monopolies, this wealth and technology that exists in the hands of the few. That's the only way, that's the only alternative to the austerity we see around us. That's the only way of getting rid of the cuts to living standards and jobs and public services that we see around us. So our task really is to build that movement. It has to start with meetings like this, with everyone in this room. We have to get organised, we have to get educated, we have to agitate. That's what the Marxist societies exist for. We have Marxist societies not just here at Warwick and Oxford, as I talked about earlier, but in 30 universities across the country. And throughout this period, thousands of people have been signing up to the Marxist Student Federation, looking for the alternative that I'm sure all of us in this room are looking for as well. It's our task to analyse what's going on, to look at the writings of Marxism, to look at the lessons of history, to learn from those, equip ourselves and arm ourselves with the only real weapons that we have as a movement, which is our ideas. That's the only real strength that we have as a movement, our numbers and our ideas, our organisation, our numbers and our ideas. These are the weapons that we have and that we need to put into action. And so I'll finish on this by saying that I think it was the French author Victor Hugo who said, "There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." And I think the ideas of socialism have definitely come, in the sense that people like Sanders, people like Trump, they talk about socialism, they're putting these ideas back on the agenda. It's up to us to ask what these ideas really mean, how we can really use them, what the real alternative is. And I say Marx went on to say further, ideas become a material force when they grip the minds of the masses. That's what we need to do. We need to get these ideas to grip the minds of the masses. People everywhere are looking for the alternative. And obviously, in the absence of any leadership, in the absence of any organised force that puts forward an alternative, then obviously they can fall prey to the kind of bigotry, the racism and the xenophobia and all these false ideas. But Marxism, as I said at the beginning, it's not a dogma, it's not a scripture, it's not some sort of one-size-fits-all approach. It's up to us to understand these as living, breathing ideas and understand that ultimately Marxist theory is a guide to action. It's a compass to try and help us orientate ourselves in these kind of stormy times. And as Marx himself said, the philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Adam, for that amazing start to the year. So now we're going to have a discussion, so people feel free to go and raise questions, discuss the ideas, etc., and also come back with other people if you feel like you want to comment.